thank you. And I think what we're going to do now is really in some ways continuing the conversation that we just had about how do you make these ideas of competitiveness and clusters and innovation work. I'm extremely pleased and honored to hopefully hearing me on the other side of the Atlantic, the Bishop William Lawrence Professor Michael E. Porter, who's with us on video from Boston. So I hope you can see us and hear us. Okay, so we need to have a little bit more volume for the audience here to be hearing you as well. Well, Michael, I think you would deserve, of course, that I read out your CV and all the accomplishments. All of the people here in the room not only know you, but have worked with the ideas that you have developed over the last decades very intensively. We had a session this morning that was called Pioneers of Cluster Mobilization. And there was one sequence in that session that I thought is maybe as good as reading about your accomplishments in different fields. It was one from one of our good friends, Professor Antoni Subira from Catalonia, and he talked about his experience in the 90s, how he looked at the industry and he said, I knew all the details about the industrial fabric of Catalonia, but then I read Michael Porter's books. I talked to him through a common friend, Eduardo Ballerini, who's unfortunately not with us anymore. And what that gave me is it gave me a structure to understand and put together all these individual complex questions of how the industry looks like. And with that understanding, I was able to move to action, to really have an impact, to change the way that regional economy has been moving forward. And maybe I think that's a very fitting explanation of what your work has done for this field, certainly on clusters and competitiveness. Now, when we thought about this session, of course we would we could have just had a presentation by you, and I know it would have been great and inspiring. But then I saw one of the recent books about your work, which is called Understanding Michael Porter by John McGrath, about your work on strategy. And I thought maybe what we'll do here today is we have a conversation instead of a presentation to really help people understand a little bit more how has your thinking evolved on clusters and competitiveness, where is it heading, what are the things that are today on your mind as you look at the world and discuss with many leaders issues of competitiveness and clusters. So let me try to kick it off. Certainly my first interaction with your work, and I think that's true for many of us that went to business school or studied business administration, was your books on competitive strategy, on competitive advantages, on company strategy, on industry analysis. You then moved in 1990 to the competitive advantage of nations and your work on competitiveness and with a more economic policy focus. Take us a little bit on the journey. What got you interested in this completely new field after you just kind of defined the field of strategy, which is already, usually enough for one academic to do in his lifetime? What got you interested in this new set of issues?
Well, first of all, Christian, I want to just say how pleased I am to be able to interact with all of you today. If I didn't have another job, I would be there. I'd be there because of TCI, because of the people that are there, because of what you all do, which is what I care so deeply about. And I would also be there because of the Basque Country and because of the tremendous relationship we've had. We may want to talk about that later. And I most of all would want to be there because of you, Christian Kietels, who have been really fundamental to my work over the last 15 years, and an incredible partner and somebody I'm very proud of. So it's just a pleasure to be involved in this process and in this dialogue. And again, I just wish I could be there in person. The work I did on companies started out with really industry structure, the value chain, and trying to understand competitive advantage and kind of the roots of sustainable success. There's sort of an intermediate step that was a book that I did. It was a collection of articles on globalization and global strategy, and we were just starting to work out the kind of analytics of what is global strategy. And of course, that started involving the issue of location. How should firms spread activities in the value chain to different parts of the world? And there was a book called Competition in Global Industries that I was the leader of a group of faculty who were kind of tackling that question, in the 80s. But and then I started to confront the issue of location. And the more I kind of looked at location around the world, the more that I started seeing that their location seemed to matter for competitive success, because you saw multiple companies in the same field succeeding in the same location. And that was not an accident. That happened over and over and over again. And so I got very fascinated with that question. And then soon after that, I was appointed by President Ronald Reagan to a presidential commission on U.S. competitiveness. That's the last time in this country we ever really had a national discussion about competitiveness. That was because of Japan and the emerging threat, it was perceived, of Japan to the American economy. And all those things came together, and I undertook this long project, which was, of course, the Competitive Advantage of Nations book. I think what's critical is that we never stopped working on companies, but we started adding another set of dimensions about the business environment, and of course the whole notion of clusters emerged from that body of work. But I think that that what really characterizes the trajectory I've been on versus much work on competitiveness is I really come from the bottoms up, looking deeply at companies and how they compete, rather than more from the top down, thinking more about the macro policy environment and then sort of saying, okay, now what does that mean for companies? And I think that's hopefully shed some new light on the question.
Thank you. I think this reflects actually a lot on the discussion that we just had. Dmitry Devon from the World Bank, who you know very well, was commenting on the fight with the Washington Consensus. And I think that is exactly kind of adding what he called the missing middle. The companies, the industries that you need to understand if you want to drive economic development. Also, just from what you said, I think what is very interesting is that you make this connection between work on global strategy and globalization and location. Because what we see in many of our discussions here is that there was a phase when clusters were perceived to just look at the local. And we're now moving to a stage where we see much more also the practical world, less local within the global context. And it seems in your work that was exactly where you were coming from, understanding the role of location in the global perspective. Now, one of the issues that is very close to many people's minds here is the role of regions, and not the least, I think, of our hosts here in the Basque region, that they think a lot about what regions can do. Your book in 1990 was called The Competitive Advantage of Nations. You've worked a lot on what that means for regions. In recent years, you had the article, Economic Performance of Regions. How has your thinking changed over time, or has the focus changed over time? How do you look at the role that different levels of geography play?
Well, it's been again a natural evolution. I think we all sort of grew up with the idea that the nation was the fundamental unit, because it so shapes the identity of any citizen. So we talk about Japan or Germany or the United States, and I think it was a natural place to start for me as I was kind of trying to understand how location mattered. But it became very clear quite soon after the publication of the Competitive Advantage of Nations that the same ideas could be applied at the subnational level. In fact, the Basque Country, one of the first places that actually we started working with on these ideas, as well as Catalonia and Minister Sobirà, were not nations. They were subnational regions with very distinct economic circumstances, even though they were both part of Spain. So it became very clear that over time, it became even more clear that there are really at least three levels at which you can think about competitiveness, and they all matter. And the more we know about competitiveness, the more we now know that we have to kind of create activity and ideally integration across those levels. So the core level, I believe, of competitiveness the kind of atomic unit of competitiveness actually is the region. Now, how we define a region and how big that is, is a complicated question we can talk about. I don't want to be an academic, but there's a lot of practical questions about how big a region is. And metropolitan areas can be seen as regions. But we believe that's where most of the action is, because most of the key assets that really drive productivity in a location are actually assets that are specific to that region. The roads there, the universities there, the people that are living there with certain sets of skills, the location of companies in a particular field there. So really the core unit is the region. Nations are important, particularly, the smaller the nation, the more the relative impact of the nation versus the region. Even in the United States, nations matter because they set certain framework policies that apply across all regions. And then what we came to learn later, which came out of some work I did in Central America and ultimately spread to other locations, is that we also have to worry about what we call the neighborhood. The neighborhood is the countries next door. And the nature of the economic integration and coordination with neighboring countries also has a profound effect on productivity and competitiveness and growth, because your neighbors, due to proximity and often due to language and accessibility and so forth, are actually your most natural trading and investment partners. And so therefore it's most easy to in a sense trade and interconnect with your neighbors. And so and good economic policy often has to start with national policy because ultimately governments sort of report up to the national level. But ultimately, good competitiveness policies have to really drive down to the subnational region and involve also some consideration of coordination with the neighbors. I believe increasingly that what we've really got to do is get much more economic focus and policy and energy down at the regional level. And some of the most successful countries are the countries that, for a variety of reasons, have very much this decentralization, this regional focus. And some countries that have made huge strides in competitiveness, like Indonesia, for example, have done so partly because they took all the decision rights out of the national capital and kind of drove a lot of activity down to the regional level.
This is, of course, one of the heatedly debated issues right here in Spain. Both with the election coming up in the Basque Country, the election coming up in Catalonia, where these issues are quite central. What's the relationship between these regions and Spain, but also the European Union a little bit more broadly? Now, one of the things that is conceptually and in practice very closely connected, of course, to the regional level, to the subnational regional level, are clusters. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about how you saw your work, your research, your thinking on clusters and cluster analysis evolve since maybe the 1990 book. It was interesting in the session this morning, we had also John Asua, who was at the time here in the government in the Basque Country, and he talked about the emergence of new ways to really identify and describe clusters and look at their impact over time, tools that did not necessarily exist when you and he kind of started out doing some work here in the Basque Country about 20, 25 years ago. How has the work evolved over time in your perspective?
Well, it certainly has evolved, and I think that first of all, this whole idea of a cluster is an evolution of ideas for which there are long historical roots. I think we've long understood this phenomena of agglomeration and the industrial districts work and Professor Beccattini's work and Marshall and others. There's kind of some work on clusters historically, but what was lacking in a lot of the earlier work on clusters was sort of the granularity of being able to understand the phenomena of clusters from a company perspective, and you needed a rich understanding of companies and how they competed and the nature of how competitive advantage is created to, I think, fully understand what a cluster was and how it really worked. And So that's kind of what I really brought to the fore. And that those outlines were really developed in competitive advantage of nations. But over time, we started to get deeper and deeper and deeper tools and concepts for looking at the cluster, how to map the cluster, how to draw boundaries of clusters. One of the first steps was to recognize what we now call IFCs, or institutions for collaboration. We sort of discovered that there was all these institutions that were not companies, and they weren't universities, and they weren't government entities, but they existed within clusters. They were trade associations, they were quality organizations. There are various kinds of networks and sort of connective organizations. And we did some work on those and did some writing about those, and that's now part of, I think, the standard thinking about clusters is you've got to kind of understand these institutions. And by the way, there's a ripe opportunity for more work there. We then ultimately started trying to quantify and make more rigorous the definition of clusters and the boundaries of clusters. Early on, cluster definition was kind of you sort of defined it yourself. It was kind of bottoms up. Every region sort of said, okay, these are the clusters, and this is how we define them. We were very, very focused on trying to get a consistent way of thinking about the boundaries of clusters and the definition of clusters. And that work will go on for many years, but we, about a decade ago, we created this cluster mapping project and started using statistical data on economic geography to actually empirically map the boundaries of clusters. And that work, which Christian, you've been deeply involved in, is evolving now to the next level. We're just about to issue a new set of cluster definitions, which, by the way, are very closely related to the previous definitions. But these new definitions have been developed through a much more sophisticated methodology with new data that we didn't have available, 8 or 10 years ago. So I think we're now starting to put a quantitative, empirical foundation to studying clusters and their impact. And now that we've got good, rigorous data on clusters across economic geography, and by the way, this exists not just for America, but for Canada, it's being developed for Mexico, and hopefully will spread globally, the European Observatory Project, we have more and more quantitative data, then we can start to more rigorously compare, how a cluster is doing in this region, this region, and this region. And we're starting to be able to then look at how clusters matter for performance. I mean, I think we all had I put forth kind of a very a very hopefully persuasive concept for why clusters mattered, but we really didn't have data in order to test that statistically. And I think that's one of the reasons that economists have, some sort of conventional academic economists have been a little skeptical about clusters. Now, of course, we have the first data. And there's the first several papers now, and we're showing really the profound impact of clusters on just about everything that matters in terms of economic performance, job growth, wages, patenting and innovation, new business formation, the longevity of new businesses. And there's a body of papers there that now are starting to provide the empirical foundation, and hopefully there'll be more of that. And then I think that the kind of final thing that I would mention here is that as we look deeply at clusters and we have better data, we are now starting to understand better how clusters are related and overlap. And again, this was always part of the theory, but now we can actually empirically see how co-location patterns overlap between chemicals and plastics, or between knowledge creation and analytical instruments. And we're starting to be able to understand now quantitatively how economies diversify, how economies move into new industries. And we can start to see that the probability of success of economic diversification is profoundly affected by the mix of clusters and which clusters you're trying to move into. So if you're a region that is producing automotive products, for example, it's much more likely that you'll be able to successfully economically diversify into production technology, which is the kind of factory automation equipment which has high interrelationships between the kind of skills that are necessary to make automobiles that you start to learn if you develop an automotive cluster. So we are seeing a day coming where we'll be able to quite rigorously help bring some light to this question of economic diversification. Economic diversification is one of the great unanswered questions in competitiveness and development. We have ideas about how to think about it, but in terms of being able to be really rigorous and data-driven about it, we're just starting to get there. And yeah, there are many more things I could say about how the ideas on clusters continue to evolve, but I'm pleased now that we're having less pushback. Many people thought that clusters was another way of saying industrial policy. And, industrial policy was fundamentally about targeting specific industries. And everybody in this room knows that clusters are not about targeting. Clusters are about a natural, fundamental process that goes on in any economic development process, which is that clusters form and upgrade if the environment allows them to. And all clusters are good. And the implication is not targeting. The implication is to create a structure so that clusters can actually form and be more productive. And I think we're starting to get over that old, tired discussion. And now we're focusing on, okay, well, how do you actually do this? And what sorts of intervention are useful, and what kinds of organizations and institutions and processes are really necessary. I think that's kind of, in my view now, a lot of the questions of what to do in economic policy have become much clearer. We kind of know sort of what to do. We know it's context specific. I heard Mr. Devins say that it's absolutely context specific. What they did in Singapore is not what you need to do in some different circumstance. But we now kind of have the tools to figure out sort of what needs to be done, what are some of the key policies that we have to put in place, what are the things we have to kind of get accomplished. But I think the great holy grail now that we spend a lot of time on here is how do we actually get it done? How do we get it done? And that's a process of how government works. That's a process of how public and private people actually work together. It's how to get things done. It's fundamentally an organizational problem. It's a problem of creating a common direction and a common vision. And I think what we spend a lot of time on here working on now is, how do we think about that systematically? Now that we kind of understand the what, how do we understand the how?
I think that connects a lot to the discussion we just had. Both Flora Painter and Richard Devin talked about both at the third element. You, Flora, talked about capacity as being absolutely critical. Dev, you talked about implementation as really what needs to come to the fore. You want to make a quick comment, Devin?
I actually have a question for Michael. Michael, great to be speaking to you from here. And many of you recognize, many of us, recognize you as being the godfather of a lot of what is being discussed. And I mean it in the good way, not the dead horse on your bed. But so carrying on, I recall having this conversation with you while riding with you to the airport when you were in Washington recently. And I just want to pursue this line of inquiry. Coming from the bank, we see real problems, and as I mentioned in my talk earlier today, we face a real problem of capture, right? When we're trying to push the notion of clusters or growth poles or even in the context of setting up SEZs and so on. And I think it would be really great to get your thoughts on how you dealt with that problem over the past 20 years of dealing with heads of state, governments, and trying to get them to see and seed the notion of clusters, industries, and so on. So help us out down here. How do we address that particular issue? And this may be really relevant to a number of the clients in the bank Group and certainly other multilateral agencies where we need to be careful about cronyism and capture of industries?
Well, it's a great question, and I think some of the things I've said are hopefully sort of precursors anyway to talking about the question. I think one of the things that we've always said that is kind of fundamental to cluster thinking is that, which I said a minute ago, which is all clusters are good. That there is, because the fundamental phenomena here is that the agglomeration and the co-location and often then the collaboration in certain respects enables productivity and productivity growth and new business formation, and that is good in any field of the economy. So I think we have to start out by getting away from the idea that, first of all, that there are some clusters that are good and some clusters that are bad, and we should understand the good ones and help them, and the bad ones we can ignore or worse. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, I think we have to get away from the notion that clusters have anything to do with intervening in competition. That is, that the cluster concept implies the need for subsidy, that it implies the need for protective tariffs, that it implies the need for any really intervention in the market process. And we've got to understand that the fundamental idea of clusters is raising the bar of competition. It's not intervening in the competitive process, it's raising the bar. And raising the bar is fundamentally about improving the asset base, the skill base, the intrusiveness of the regulatory environment, and not about subsidy or intervention or sort of tilting the world in favor of a particular location. I've always thought it very ironic that the Krugman work was really all about intervening in competition in order to favor one location gaining in the economies of scale. Which is a deeply flawed idea. I mean, that got us onto a horrendously bad track in terms of thinking about economic policy. We know that doesn't work very well. So if we have those two ideas, then I think the next idea we have to get across is the idea that cluster development isn't about spending large amounts of money. There's an instinctive understanding or belief on the part of many government folks that I talk to that if you're going to do clusters, that means you got to have a big checkbook, and so that you can write checks to spend lots of money to do things. And again, the basic concept and the work we do suggests, no, this isn't about writing big checks. This isn't about spending lots of money. This is about actually just fixing things and constraints in the environment. And yes, there may need to be some money for certain kinds of technology assets or certain kinds of training programs or university programs, but ultimately the cluster concept is really about not about money, but it's really about setting better policies, having better collaboration, getting the existing entities more effective because they're understanding better the role they play in working with other entities or seeding sophisticated people to other entities. So now, in order to avoid the sort of capture phenomena, I think the best defense often is just objective data, and rather than have it be a matter of opinion, what clusters are emerging or what clusters we really ought to support. The more we can actually have real data, the more we can actually provide some analytical rigor to really diagnosing the state of a given cluster, the more we get insulate ourselves a little bit from this idea that they're cronies of the government and they use this cluster idea as simply a way of getting subsidies and support, And of course, that's the big nightmare that I've been living with now for 20 years, and that is that the whole idea gets captured for a fundamentally different purpose than it was ultimately designed, to try to reveal and help understand. And of course, that happens, all over the world. So what we have to do is we have to understand what it's all about. And I guess one final point I'd make is that cluster development doesn't work very often if it's heavily driven by government. We really needs to see it as a bottoms-up process in which government is a participant. Government does things that help or hurt, but ultimately it's a bottoms-up process where private sector must take the lead. And the more you get multiple people in the private sector together, the more you start having checks and balances that guard against kind of the kind of distortion or subsidies that get introduced when there's cronyism or when a certain powerful industry sort of uses this as a way of capturing more resources in the society. So I don't know if I've answered that question. It's really a hard question. But once again, I think the people in this room care about something that many academics don't care about, and that is, how does things happen in the real world? And how do you and I think the cluster concept is really a descriptive concept with an analytical underpinning that kind of explains what it is and why it happens. But then the question is, what do you do about it in the real world? That becomes a very, very complicated question, which is riddled with issues like capture and distortion and misunderstanding and politics. And I think for the World Bank, that's an issue in every single country in which you work. How can we actually make our work objective and based on kind of the realities of development and inoculate ourselves from all the biases and distortions that get introduced because of politics, because of friends of the president, because of market power, where a couple of companies really have a tremendous amount of market power. Our challenge as practitioners here is to navigate across both understanding how the world works and these key concepts, but also knowing how to intervene, how not to intervene, what works, what doesn't work. Let me stop there because this is a question that's animating a lot of my attention right now.
And I think it's, as you very rightly said, Mike, I think this is an issue that all of us here in the room, all in the TCI network, are deeply concerned about. How do we take these ideas into action? How do we make sure that we avoid the real danger there is? Somebody this morning said, the big problem is not that if a new government comes in, that they change the name of the cluster program. The bigger danger is that they keep the name cluster program, but they institute something that's very different from the underlying idea. And I think that is only too true. Now I know we're starting to get to the end of our time here. What I would love to do is, a lot of people don't know about the breadth of your work in other fields as well, and it's all connected to the idea to competition. But I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about some of the other efforts that you are engaged in, some of the other topics that you are currently working on and will continue to work on for the next few years.
Well, thank you, Christian. I'd be happy to. I think the first thing I would mention is that we are deeply focused on this topic of economic development. And about a decade ago, we created a course at Harvard. I never really taught a course on economic development. I was teaching strategy, company strategy, and we developed a course which is called MOC, Microeconomics of Competitiveness. Some of you may have heard of it. And we decided that we would make that course not just a course at Harvard, but we would make it a course, sort of a platform that many schools in many countries could participate in. And we have now, over the years, built up a set of affiliated universities around the world. I think we hit 102 this year. We have universities from every continent, and it's kind of a collaboration of schools and faculty, all of whom care a lot about economic development and use this course and the curriculum that we developed as sort of a platform for engaging students and in many cases practitioners on this issue. So I'm still deeply involved in building out the MOC course and the network. And anybody in this room that doesn't have an MOC affiliated university in your country, we'd love to talk to you. We'd love to have the good universities in every country teaching about these core ideas, because the more that we have bright young people understanding the concepts and the way of looking at the world and understanding the reality of international competition, the better things will go. And the Basque Country is a great example. You know, John Asua and his colleagues there at Orchestra and in the Basque Country have been teaching MOC to leading Basque, citizens and young people now for many years. And that means there's really a kind of a common understanding of competitiveness in the Basque Country. There's a kind of a common understanding of the idea of clusters and what they are and what they aren't. And that's been enormously influential in the ability of Basque Country to perform so well. We're very proud of John. We're very proud of the Basques. What an amazing story, despite a lot of complexity in terms of, the politics in Spain and ETA and all this kind of stuff. We have an economy that's just been remarkably dynamic. I think because there's been a clear, common understanding of what it takes to succeed. And so the MOC, though, leads to one thing I wanted to say, which is we've now been teaching MOC for about 10 years. And so there's another book about competitiveness that is being written as we speak. And how long it takes is always imponderable for me because I'm a little bit slow. But it's going to try to develop these other dimensions that have been the result of the 20 years of work that we've been doing since then, and some of the work that Christian you've been involved in, and many other people in this room. So there's another book on competitiveness. We're not done there. But now, related to that, Harvard Business School has taken on a major initiative of the school on U.S. competitiveness. The U.S. economy is facing some really severe discontinuities that have developed. We have some serious problems here in the U.S. economy, and the school has taken this on. We've done a large body of work on U.S. competitiveness, and that's been the result. That's led to a lot of articles, surveys, and we are. And I am co-leading that effort with Jan Rifkin, who leads our strategy group here at Harvard, and we're very excited about how to move practice in America and how to use the business community, how to mobilize the business community to get deeply engaged in the issue of competitiveness. And I think there's some useful learning that's coming out of this project that hopefully we can communicate. And we share what we're doing with any school in the world or any organization in the world that wants to do the same kind of work on their economy that we're doing on the U.S. economy. We'd be happy to share that. Two other things I'd mention. About a decade ago, I started working on healthcare delivery, how we could change the way healthcare is delivered to dramatically improve the value. There's a book on that. There's a whole body of work on that now that I'm very proud of. So I'm working a lot on healthcare systems and working with hospitals and hospital systems and physicians and other healthcare professionals on, how do we think about changing the way we do healthcare to drive value, using kind of value principles in that field. And then the final thing I'd mention is the work on what we call creating shared value. If you kind of go from company strategy, which is where I started, to location and economic development, now there's kind of a feedback loop, which is, okay, now that we understand, kind of what creates prosperity and how we make things better for citizens, now what is the role of business in that? And the work on shared value talks about how we can kind of extend our thinking about economic value creation to get companies much more engaged in creating social value at the same time as they're creating economic value. And that article, Creating Shared Value, is something that has led to quite a global dialogue, and I speak about that with businesses, all over the world. And we have to re-energize business to be seen as a really positive force in society. And I think we in business have sort of lost our way with CSR programs and so forth. And so this work on shared value is an attempt to kind of get business engaged in the process of driving community and national improvement without the idea that this is charity or patriotism. What is in our interest in business? What can we really affect? How can we turn solutions to societal problems into economic models, the whole body of work on that. So you can see all these pieces sort of ultimately come together and fit together. But it's a very exciting time for me personally. And again, I feel so at home, even though I'm in Boston. I feel so at home in that meeting because of what all of you do and what you care about, and the fact that you're out there actually trying to change things on the ground. And that's what really matters. So I look forward to, hopefully next time I'll be there in person, and I look forward to this dialogue continuing for many years to come. I also look forward to the continued work with Christian and with Mr. Devin and with many of others of you, as we take this forward.
Thank you very much, Mike. We would love to have you at the party tonight, which will happen only in a few hours from now. Now, one thing really hasn't changed with you. You talked a lot about how things evolved over time, your energy and enthusiasm about the things that you work on. And I think that's an inspiration to all of us in this area. So thank you very much. Goodbye to Boston. Have a good day, and we'll see you soon.